Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with another episode of Ask Dave. And today's question was a doozy, a whopper. It was, does classical music have a future? Or what is the future of classical music? Sort of a combination question. The two are really the same question, because one is implicit in the other. And oh my goodness, we're going to have a good time chatting about this because, if there's anything classical music people like to do, it's talk about the future of classical music. In fact, some people like to talk about the future of classical music more than they like listening to classical music. I'm not one of those people, of course, but I am more than happy to take a swat at this question, and let's see what happens. The simple answer is yes. Classical music does have a future. End of video. Now, there's actually a little bit more to it than that. Let's divide it into three juicy categories when we talk about the future. First, there is the classical music commercial industry, the business of popularizing and selling classical music, which has always been hopeless and will always be hopeless. But I want to talk a little bit about how it's going to deal with things. And next, there is the cultural aspect of classical music, which is its own military-industrial complex, which we will deal with shortly. And finally, there is the audience for classical music, the people on the receiving end of all of this largesse that we'll be discussing. So those are sort of the three big categories that together as a group determine what the classical music, the future of classical music is going to be and what the shape of it looks like it's going to take. And we'll see if we can draw any conclusions from that. So let's start with the business. And when it comes to the business, I'm not going to go on, ragging on about how, the record labels are stupid and, the whole thing is crazy. It is. We know they are. But I want to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story. Back in the day when I was running the Cannes Classical Awards at the MIDEM Music Convention in Cannes, France every year in the early 90s, we had there was a internet themed convention. And of course, the Reed organization, it was Reed MIDEM, which ran the thing, wanted to do this to attract as many sort of high-tech music people as possible. And classical music was just, a teeny, tiny fragment of the entire huge convention. It was the whole music industry and music publishing industry and everything. So there were a million booths and stands. You walk around, you meet all these people. And in those days, the big idea for the internet was what they call portal sites. Now, some of you may not know what those are because none of them exist anymore. Andante was one of them, which lasted probably the longest. It lasted maybe 2 years. But there were a whole bunch of other ones. And what they did was they attempted to aggregate all of the classical music websites that they could get their little fingers into in one spot. And so that they could get as much of the limited audience for classical music as possible. And their concept was that they were going to get all of this traffic, which they would then allocate to the various, affiliated sites that they had managed to subsume. And in doing so, they would attract just mega billions of advertising and subscribers and stuff. Well, they all disappeared. They were all gone within about a year. And I went from booth to booth talking to these people, and it was amazing what they said they had. There were the people who they signed up the Berlin Philharmonic and the Vienna Philharmonic for streaming services. They were going to do all of this stuff. They were going to be the place to go for classical music. There were a couple here in New York. They had attracted investors who put millions, and I mean millions of dollars, into building these enormously sophisticated web interfaces. And I remember sitting in a control room for one of these people where they were showing us, I think it was going to be like the Gergiev Mahler 2 from the White Nights Festival. And they had this fabulous conference room with all these high-tech screens and all that. And they were going to show us what the site did. And they pushed a button and nothing worked. It didn't work at all. It was hopeless. And I showed them ClassicsToday.com, which was then only in its infancy, but was simple. It was a search engine and reviews, and it worked because it was rather limited in what it was supposed to do, but we made sure at least that it could do what it said it was going to do. And these other people had no clue. I don't even remember what they were called. They're all gone now. But what happened? What happened was that the industry adapted, and they adapted to what the market really was. Organizations like the Berlin Philharmonic, the Vienna Philharmonic, orchestras all over the place, they do their own streaming. They didn't need these portal sites. They were better off doing it themselves. And they had their own local audiences, which by classical music standards, by the way, were huge. And so they were able to attract their own groups, and maybe some of them make money, maybe some of them don't. But they're doing it their own way, the only way that was feasible and the only way that made sense within their financial constraints. So they adapted gradually over time. And at the same convention, I was asked to participate in a panel discussion. And the panel discussions back then, oh, these were so cool because they were international. And, they had people with, the headphones and translators in multiple languages, translating things in real time. It was like the United Nations. It was really nifty. So I'm sitting there on this panel, and I was representing, the music magazine internet component of the industry. And there were other people doing other aspects of the business, including a bunch of people from these portal sites. And next to me was a guy who was doing music publishing, online music publishing, who they since vanished entirely, who had the most appalling breath I've ever met in a human being. It was like sewage. I mean, every time he opened his mouth, it was like all the oil refineries in North Jersey wafting your way. And, you have to sit there smiling. And I just wanted to go like this. It was disgusting. Anyway, so we're doing this panel discussion, right? And the question is, how do you make money on the internet? And at the time, ClassicsToday.com was just another internet magazine. We were making money the way all the magazines did because the industry, that is the record labels, supported us with advertising. Very minimally, I might add, because they were not themselves persuaded of the viability of online magazines, which was really a rather silly position, we thought at the time, and still do, but that's okay. Anyway, they come to me and they say, how do you make money on the internet? And I said, very simply, the only thing that makes money on the internet right now is pornography. And as this was translated into 5 or 6 different languages, you could see the reaction on the audience. They all just went, they all just gasped. And I thought it was extremely funny. But it was the truth back then. Nobody knew. None of us knew how we were going to make money on the internet. What happened? What happened was you find ways to give people a product that they want, and if they want it enough, they'll pay something for it. Is that enough to keep your business afloat? Maybe not. Depends on what your business model is. It depends on what your expenses are. You have to adapt to the reality of the marketplace. But what I have seen in the intervening 20 or so years is that that's exactly what's happened. The producers of music, the online streaming services, none of which existed back then, by the way, they've all adapted to the marketplace and found a way to create products that people will pay for. Now, not all of them make money and not all of them will get rich. And it's we are in a constant state of disruption and ferment, but it's there. And it's there in huge quantities, and there's no shortage of money being invested in it. So the future of the classical music industry is, yes, there will be a classical music industry. It will adapt to whatever the demands of the marketplace and the listening audience are combined. And that's about all you can say about it, because that's the way the marketplace works. And I think I'm very optimistic about it, frankly, because I see no diminishment in the amount of stuff, or diminution, whatever the word is, the amount of stuff that's available to us. And it's available to us at a cheaper price than it's ever been available. So, nothing to fetch about there, right? So let's move to part 2. Let's talk about the performing arts people. Now, the performing arts people are sort of a special case because, they are part of the entire general picture of cultural enrichment of which classical music is a part. And don't get me wrong, even though I say classical music is just entertainment, which it is a high-end entertainment, or it can be. And I'm totally in favor of cultural enrichment. I really am. I believe that there should be civics classes that are mandatory in all schools, public and private. I believe we need to create a cohesive society by understanding our shared cultural and legal and historical past and history and values, including the good stuff and the bad stuff, all of it. I'm all for that. I really am. So classical music is always going to have an existence to the extent that it's considered something of cultural value, which means it's going to be supported. It's going to be supported by government subsidy in one way or another. Now, whether that subsidy is a direct subsidy, as in Europe, or it's the not-for-profit corporation tax-free status, as it is in this country, it's a support, it's a subsidy. And so as long as it's subsidized, it's going to be freed from the obligation to earn money. However, and this is the fun part, the people who are participating in this activity, that is the artists and the performing arts organization, are the biggest collection of whiny little bitches that you will ever encounter in your mortal existence. Trust me. And the reason for that is that, first of all, they all subscribe to this sort of post-Wagnerian artist romantic hero concept, which is that because they're involved in culture and because certain people in government or elsewhere have thought that this is significant, they believe that they deserve to be supported. And there is no amount of money you could throw at them that will satisfy them. None. They want more, always more, never less. And they deserve to be supported to the extent to which they exist. So in response to that, our conservatories and music education institutions have churned out thousands and thousands and thousands of superbly trained musicians, all looking for work, all believing that they need to be supported, and all whining like the little babies they are when they don't get the money that they feel that they're entitled to. And it's really, I think, one of the most awful groups of people that exist. It's horrible. There will always be room for fabulously talented people. Some of them will be stars. Some of them will not. They will be jealous and backstabbing and vindictive, and they will be trying to ceaselessly make us feel guilty because we're not giving them enough. And it's just awful. It's an awful culture. It's an awful way to think about culture. But that's what it is. So, do they have a future? Of course they have a future. Do they have the future they want? Of course not. They're never going to have the future they want because there's never going to be enough. And we, as I think classical music consumers, must not drink the poisoned Kool-Aid. We must never believe that because an orchestra goes out of business for lack of funds, or because something happens that they don't like, that somehow it's our fault, somehow that the classical music culture is letting them down, that the industry is tanking, that the world is coming to an end. They have this millenarian, apocalyptic vision of what they're doing because they feel so underappreciated. And I don't appreciate them at all. So there you go. Maybe they have reason to, because it's just entertainment. That's what they are. They're entertainers. They may be entertainers tasked with the responsibility of providing some sort of education or enrichment as to some significant aspect of our cultural heritage. But that's their responsibility. That's something they have to take seriously and do. It's not something that I have to pay to support if I think that they're doing it incompetently, which, as often as not, is the case. It's really just an extraordinary phenomenon because they've become institutionalized. So sure, they have a future because they're institutionalized. But because they've allowed themselves to become institutionalized, they don't have complete freedom over the shape in which their lives are going to take. They don't control the amount of subsidy they get. They don't control how much attention they get from us, the public, but they're insured of a certain baseline minimum. And that's the deal they've made. And so I don't feel sorry for them at all. There are splendidly enterprising artists out there who've shown that you can make money, that you can have an audience, that you can create an audience for what you offer. And they do it, and it's wonderful. And I am behind them 100% for doing that, because that takes some vision and initiative and creativity. And if they forswear, the public funding aspect of it, then good for them, because that's possible too. But I really have very little sympathy and very little fear that these people are going to go away anytime soon, because there's just too much invested in it. It's that cultural angle that's going to keep them afloat forever, frankly. I mean, they're just a bureaucracy. They're an entrenched bureaucracy. And so until we no longer have public subsidies and tax-free corporations and whatnot, they don't have anything to worry about. But there's too much of it. There's way, way too much of it. And the technology is against them. That's the most interesting aspect of it. For example, if you've seen the Metropolitan Opera recently doing its televised broadcast, you can go to a movie theater and see the Metropolitan Opera. Now, if the Metropolitan Opera is supposedly, the flagship operatic cultural institution in the United States, and they are able to use modern technology to essentially beam themselves into every movie house or living room or whatever receiving medium exists, then why do you need your local opera house? Why do you need any of these hundreds of other opera houses that are running around begging for money? The fact of the matter is you don't. You can just go see the Met, which is the best. Of course it isn't. I mean, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And that means that local arts institutions are going to have to work harder to try and justify their existence in the face of the ready availability of the Met, the Vienna State Opera, all this stuff on video. The competition is getting fiercer, which means that the moans and shrieking are getting louder and more desperate, because, they have to work harder. Well, too bad. Work harder. That's what you're there for. If you care, you'll work harder. If you don't, see ya. That's how I feel about those people. But future, no problem. Now, let's talk about the audience. The audience for classical music has always been small, relatively small. Why is it? Because of what classical music essentially is. It's something that requires a certain investment of time, which means a certain freedom of leisure activity, perhaps a certain level of education at some level. I mean, there are always people who are simply highly educated musically and like it because of that. But there are also just as many people who come to it through other avenues. And those avenues are usually educational avenues because they've read about it or heard about it or studied something or have an advanced degree at something or other. And so that has a musical aspect or component. So the audience is very small. It requires a certain amount of money, free time and money. And I mean, that's just the way it is, because you've got to be able to spend hours a day listening to music. And to have hours a day, to have that kind of free time, and to want to devote it to music as opposed to something else like, auto racing or any other leisure activity, you've got to have a certain mindset. So the number of people and their age, because older people tend to have more leisure time, especially once they've retired, and their amount of disposable income are all factors. And that means that when you aggregate it all together, the number of people who are interested in classical music seriously is very small. It's always been, as a function of the record market, something like 3%, 4%. Maybe it's less now. But then, of course, the record market is much bigger. I mean, the audience for classical music is always growing, by the way. It's growing because the population is growing. So that, as a percentage, it may be getting smaller, but as a raw number of people who are listening to it, it's usually getting larger in most places. But none of that is really the point. What I really find shocking and very striking is the comments that I've seen, which partly engendered this particular discussion, which say things like, well, the classical music is declining and we have to get young people. I love that one. No, you don't have to get young people. I did a whole video called To Hell with Young People. You don't. You need to get the audience that's ready to enjoy and purchase and savor and get into what you offer, whatever that audience is. And you have no reason to disparage one group, senior citizens, retired people, because you're seeking to get another group. A group which, by the way, I mean, from an industry and cultural institution standpoint, they basically have no competence to approach, or very little competence to approach. Sometimes they do it, most of the time not, so it's a wash. Now, again, I'm totally in favor of exposing this to people in schools, to getting them as part of an educational curriculum, putting music back into our educational institutions, all of those things. I think that's all wonderful. I really do. But is it really going to build the audience for classical music? I don't believe it will, because there's tons of it available to people now. It's in movies, it's in commercials, people hear it all the time. It's in the environment. And ironically, the same people who are so desperately afraid that young people are not being exposed to classical music disparage efforts to use it in people's daily lives. That is, on television and in normal activities as a musical accompaniment to something, or turning it into pop songs, or whatever it is. I think that's all great. You should use it. It should be out there. It doesn't matter how people come to it, but they make the distinction. Our cultural tastemakers say that the way you learn it is more important than the fact that you learn it. And that's a mistake. That's wrong. So the audience for classical music has been relatively stable basically since the dawn of time. It's a certain percentage, a certain fixed percentage, and it probably isn't going to grow, but I also don't think it's going to diminish. Remember that the classical music that today's audience listened to was originally listened to by a teeny tiny fraction, because it was written for aristocratic patronage. It was the private reserve of certain wealthy kings and monarchs, or incredibly wealthy bourgeoisie, as happened in the 19th century, and audiences were very small, and opportunities to hear this stuff were very, very few and far between before recordings existed and before radio existed. So what are we worried about? There's more stuff available today for less money, as I've said a million times, than at any other time in human history. There's more music available. The amount of music that is available on recordings is so much larger than the repertoire, the active performing repertoire that you'll ever hear in concert. There's tons and tons and tons of it, and the avenues to access it are more varied than ever before. You have physical product, you have radio, you have television and other broadcast, you have internet streaming services. It's all out there. And people are listening to it. Look at the popularity of some of the things on YouTube. Concerts, and every artist in the world is shoving out videos. I'm shoving out videos. There's an enormous amount of activity dedicated to reaching out to the audience for classical music, whatever it is. And I know there's an audience, and there's always going to be an audience. So what are you worried about? Of course, there's a future. There's a future for the audience. It all has a future. And that is the sum total of my feeling about the future of classical music. Whatever the future is, we know it's going to be different than it will be today. And I want to make it very, very clear and say very, very passionately and strongly to all of you naysayers and the people who think that the apocalypse is upon us, that the fact that things are going to be different, which they will be, that's a guaranteed, does not mean that they will be worse. You may not like those differences. They may not appeal to you. You may disparage them for any number of reasons, but nobody cares what you think. Nobody's interested in your opinion of whether it's good or bad. It will be, and it will be different. And those who are there will adapt and enjoy it. And nothing, no matter how much it changes, nothing is preventing you from finding what you want and enjoying what you like personally. And if the rest of the world doesn't agree with you, or not enough people agree with you, that's your problem. It has nothing to do with the classical music industry or the future of classical music or anything else. It's just your own sour grapes, So chew on them. What can I tell you? The future is going to be fine as far as I'm concerned, and I look forward to it. And I look forward to talking about it and adapting to it and finding the good and yakking about some of the less good. But ultimately, it's there and it's all going to be great. And I really just think we should feel very, very good about where we are and what we can do and the wonderful opportunities we have to share all of this fabulous music. And just ignore the fetching. Please, just ignore it. I mean, it's so anti-productive. Let's put it that way. Anyway, thank you for asking this question. I hope this gives you some food for thought about where the classical music industry may be going. Keep on listening and take care.